And then another thing, sort of the question that comes up often is, what about the reefs that have been damaged already? Is there any chance for them? And in the last couple of decades, the reef restoration science has sort of developed, and there is some hope actually to sort of do a bit of work on the damaged reefs and get them to recover. So a couple of definitions before we go into the restoration itself. So restoration is basically bringing the ecosystem precisely to what it was before. When it comes to the coral reefs, it's often very difficult to do because of the complexity of the coral reef itself. So this term is not what most of the coral projects in Maldives do, because it's pretty much impossible. A definition that's slightly better is rehabilitation. And
so this is the act. So here we go, you can read it. The act of partially or more rarely fully replacing the structural or functional sort of characteristics of the reef. So we're not going to bring it back to exactly how it was, but we can try our best, and it's going to replace certain aspects of the reef that were there before. So for us, we actually like to use this term rehabilitation, but I guess it's all how you want to use your terminology. So we'll continue on to projects in the Maldives.
So in the Maldives, we sort of spent a lot of time online trying to look up information, and things that come up, of course, it's the coral frames by Seamark, particularly at Four Seasons properties, nice and sort of available, accessible to the public, big projects as well, covered in the international literature as well. And other than that, we really struggled. We found some information about concrete blocks at Santara, and that's about it. That was on the internet, which is quite surprising considering the number of projects that we hear about from our guests. So guests very often will come to us and they'll say, oh, I've been to this resort and we've built a fish house or grown some coral. And we didn't manage to find anything. So these projects remain cryptic, but there's a lot of potential. There's a lot of information that's not being utilized. Every marine biologist finds exciting things when he does his project at the resort. And there's a lot to share, and we think it's a great opportunity. Even if it's the small things, sort of what works, what doesn't work, it's really important to sort of have this information publicly available. So we think there's a great potential there for every single project.
So we move into methods around the world. So obviously there's lots and lots of different methods and ways of doing this. We wanted to generalize on these sort of two steps. You can either use a method which is what we call the single-step method. Otherwise, it's this two-step method. So first of all, the single step's very, very simple. You've got your donor reef, which is very, very healthy. You take corals from there, and then you move them onto your target reef that you're trying to restore. So it's simple. You're moving it from one place, you're putting it somewhere else. And you can either put it straight onto a reef like this one, otherwise you can put it onto an artificial substrate, a frame or something like that. The other one is our two-step theory here, and this is utilizing a nursery as the first step, and then the second step is where we then would move it onto the target reef. And this is what we've chosen to do with our Coral Lines project. So there's other steps as well. Sorry, Vaidotas. Go ahead.
There we go. Yeah, so before we go into the Coral Lines itself, we also wanted to cover some of the projects around the world. In terms of single steps, so donor reef, straight onto the target reef. There's obviously the coral trays here in Maldives, also a similar thing with BioRock company, which also uses a metal frame, except it plugs in power to it, and that supposedly, according to BioRock company, ensures better calcification in the coral and better survival. So there's a nice example there with quite beautiful coral. There's also attempts where people, instead of transferring coral, they just make habitat, introduce some complexity by putting an artificial substrate. So there's some tires there. There's also reef balls in Grand Cayman. These are just a few examples. And then there's the two-step methods.
So with our two-step method, as I mentioned before, we're using a nursery. So here, this is in Thailand. They're using sort of a net substrate with a nice plastic frame around the edge. And you can take quite small pieces and stick them in that nursery for a certain period of time, perhaps a year. And then you move it onto this target reef. So this is the same project. So you can see it's quite a barren target reef. And they've got some little fragments on there that hopefully will grow. So what are the benefits of our two-step method that we've chosen to use? It decreases pressure on the donor reef. So we're taking corals from one healthy reef. If we were to then put the corals in the nursery, it allows them time to grow. So this means that we can take smaller pieces from the donor reef than if we were just putting them straight onto our target reef, in which case we'd have to take bigger pieces to allow for survival rates. Our nurseries actually provide great conditions as well for the little corals. So you can see this one up in Florida here. It's elevated above the sediment and it's away from the coral reef. So this removes threats such as coral-eating animals, so things like propeller snails here on the bottom, crown-of-thorns starfish and things like that. But also it's above the seafloor, removing the sediment as well, so less sand is going to settle on the corals. And if you think about putting a nursery in quite a clever place, you can also ensure some really great water flow as well. So good oxygen's coming through, lots of nutrients as well. So the idea behind it is that it's actually going to increase the growth rate of our corals and increase the survival rate of the corals as well.
Yeah, and it's basically silviculture, forestry. That's what they do there as well.